Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's conversation between Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani, author of The Cities We Need, Essential Stories of Everyday Places, and Prithi Kanakamedala, author of Brooklynites, the remarkable story of free Black communities that shaped a borough. We are delighted to have you all joining us tonight at Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Andrew Fairweather, and I'm a librarian here at SNFL. Before I start, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening's possible. I would also like to remind you that if you don't have a library card, it's easy to get one by visiting any information desk in this building. I would also like to remind you that if you don't, finally, I'd like to encourage you to visit NYPL's website and take a look at upcoming 7 Stories Up programs like this one. We have an excellent lineup this season featuring new fiction, nonfiction, music, local history, and more. We would love to have you join us in this space again. And now let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani is a writer, artist, and co-founder of the interdisciplinary studio on place and dialogue, Buscata. She is the author of The Cities We Need, Essential Stories of Everyday Places, published by MIT Press, and also Contested City, Art and Public History as Mediation at New York's Seward Park Urban Renewal Area, published by University of Iowa Press. She's a finalist and honoree for the MAS Brendan Gill Award, a widely exhibited photographer. She was a professor of urban studies at the New School for a decade and has been a fellow at the International Center of Photography and the Center for Urban Community Research at Goldsmiths, University of London. She holds a doctorate in environmental psychology from the Graduate Center of CUNY. Prithi Kanakamedala is a professor of history at Bronx Community College, CUNY, and serves as a faculty coordinator at PS2, the Public Scholarship Practice Space, housed at the Center for the Humanities at the CUNY Graduate Center. She is also an active public historian and works with a range of cultural organizations, including Dance Space Project, Inc., Place Matters, City Lore, New York Public Library, Brooklyn Historical Society, now Center for Brooklyn History at Brooklyn Public Library, and Weeksville Heritage Center. Brooklynites, the remarkable story of free Black communities that shaped a borough, published by the NYU Press. Her first full-length book won the 2024 Victorian Society of New York Book Award and was a finalist for the Gotham Book Prize. Without further ado, please welcome Gabrielle and Prithi.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Gabrielle, did you want to tell everybody what we're doing?
Yes, I will.
Okay, all right.
It's so good to see all of you here. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to be in conversation with each other. It's something that's been kind of a long time coming, and it's really exciting to be doing it here. So thank you so much to 7 Stories Up for having us, and to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library and all of New York Public Library. It's such a beautiful space, and actually, we came up to this roof deck to celebrate the final turning in of our manuscripts of these books. So it's very full circle to be here. And thank you very much to Andrew Fairweather in particular, and to all of the staff here at 7 Stories Up. But Andrew, thank you so much for inviting us in and connecting us. Also, thank you to Kemi Alasami and to Samson Starkweather, who really insisted that this doc had to happen, so about a year ago. So thank you for that. And what we're gonna be doing tonight is that we're each gonna read a little bit from our books, very short, and then we'll talk a little bit about how the projects that spawn them began, what the crossovers are in the kind of work, especially around how they're rooted in public work, also our experience as writing partners, and thinking about why the spaces that both of these books talk about are so essential right now. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Prithi.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabrielle. And thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'm going to hand it back to Gabrielle to read from your book. And then we will have a conversation, and then hopefully soon enough be in conversation with all of you. Here we go. Brooklyn has a distinct story to tell in the history of social justice. From the end of the American Revolution to the start of the Civil War, Brooklyn expanded from one of 6 former colonial agricultural towns that lay on stolen indigenous land in Kings County to the 3rd largest city in the United States. As it did so, Brooklyn's small but growing free Black community, ordinary people from all walks of life, including business people, church leaders, educators, homeowners, journalists, laborers, and writers, sought to grow their city in a radical anti-slavery vision. The 19th century residents of Brooklyn Heights, Fort Greene, Weeksville, Williamsburg, and the areas we know today as downtown Brooklyn and Vinegar Hill, and Dumbo, engaged in a multifaceted struggle as they organized and agitated for racial and social justice. They did so even as their own freedom was threatened by a magnitude of injustices, including racial violence, systemic and structural racism, racial capitalism, and the potential for kidnapping into slavery in the South. These Brooklynites met in the city's churches, schools, parks, homes, public platforms, and private spaces. In choosing to live in or in close proximity to an emerging urban landscape surrounded by the vast New York harbor, they took advantage of a city on the rise in order to pursue economic opportunities and build and sustain their communities. Brooklynites tells the rich story of New York's 2nd largest borough and 4 sets of families from its 19th century free Black community. The Krogers, the Hodges, the Wilsons, and the Gloucesters, all of whom call this place home. It is a place-based cultural and social history of Brooklyn, and it is a book about family, traditional biological ones and the ones we intentionally create to strengthen our human bonds, what we call chosen family. In The Right to the City, the geographer David Harvey writes, quote, "The question of what kind of city we want to be cannot be divorced from the question of what kind of people we want to be, what kinds of social relations we seek. The freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is one of the most precious yet most neglected of our human rights," end quote. Today, we owe a debt to the activism of these Brooklynites, and the legacy of their work is still immeasurable. Conceptualizing freedom remains essential to our humanity and the ways in which we make life. Our contemporary context for inequality in both New York City and the United States did not arbitrarily begin with redlining, segregation, broken windows policing, and urban renewal in the 20th century. No, how we got here is deeply connected to the history of Brooklyn in the 18th and 19th centuries. Agitating for social justice in education, housing, safety, and voting, and challenging racial capitalism itself were part of the agenda. And these ideas continue to shape our vision of what a democracy can even look like today. If today's present moment, and I was writing this 3 years ago, by the way, but if today's present moment pessimistically reflects this country's long history and legacies of colonialism, genocide, slavery, imperialism, capitalism, gentrification, and displacement, through the rise of populism, domestic terrorism through white supremacy, racial violence, and deeply embedded anti-Black racism, I would say Brooklyn's Black communities have lessons to teach us all. History has never been one of linear progress. It remains in circular motion, with each revolution inching us slowly towards a more just society. Brooklynites is a story of necessity. In the stories of Brooklyn's 19th century free Black residents and their activism, history can be one of majestic hope, deep humanity, and love. This is a story of placemaking, of land, home, and labor, of New Yorkers past and the legacy they left us. This is the story of Brooklyn. Thank you. Oh, yeah, no, please feel free to fast forward. Yeah, sure. So the slides are just some of the many archives that are featured in the book. And I often have them as revolving images or rotating images, just because I do appreciate nobody wants to look at me for a good 5-10 minutes. And it came out of a public project, which we will talk about further. But this is, and I'm sure they're much older now, some amazing New York City school kids who came to the exhibit that this book came out of. Awesome. I'm going to hand over to you, Gabrielle.
All right. Thank you. And I hope you will see in the pieces of these two books the real deep connection between the work and kind of how we go from one time period to another, but really to see the connections between the kinds of places that we're talking about. So I started this work in about 20 years ago and asking my neighbors in Prospect Heights, Brooklyn, and then again in Mosswood in Oakland, California, for tours of their neighborhoods, so of their everyday places. And I started making photographs of the places that they took me to. And two things are really important to me kind of in the way that I work. One is in understanding dialogue and art making kind of as a way of knowing, and also in really valuing people's lived experience and people's lived expertise. So I'm going to take you back all the way to, not as far back as Prithi, but to 2001, when I asked Mike in Prospect Heights how he had prepared to take me on the tour of his neighborhood that I had requested. And he explained, I said to myself, we'll take a walk around the block and I'll tell you what I know, you know? So much of the work of really being human happens in everyday places. We become ourselves. We become able to see each other, to be a community. Everyday places are personal, but also global, intertwining history, emotion, memory, politics. They're experienced, talked about, negotiated, woven into our lives. And we create places, and in turn, places create us. It's not too much to say that some of these small public and semi-private spaces even have the potential to be spaces of liberation. It's in these spaces that we find the cities we need. So what are these remarkable everyday spaces? Prithi named some of them already. Maybe they're supermarkets. They're often really thought of as banal. Sidewalks, diners, bus stops, churches, meeting places, barber shops, bike shops, repair shops, donut shops, laundromats, schools, parks, playgrounds, libraries. So the work that these places do helps us to become ourselves and to become communities, and I call that work place work. There's this thing of doing, what these places do by enabling us to become ourselves and to become communities. These places do really nothing short of creating the possibility for a functional society. And without the work that these kinds of places do, or without places that do that kind of work, our lives are at best hollow and at worst filled with violence. And so this is a book about the work places do to support our becoming ourselves, our becoming communities, and becoming themselves was what David told me about at the supermarket that you saw, Danya at the diner, Cynthia in front of her house, and Marty on neighborhood streets. It's really intensely personal work that happens in public. Places can help our bodies feel free, and they can also help us feel that we belong. So becoming community, or at least just being together with strangers, if, like lower the bar, was what I heard from Tewolde in the donut shop, Neville in the electronics store, Julia at the fence. And I could see how their places fostered really important kinds of talk. So both casual talk and really enduring talk over time. And in most of these places that people took me to, they were spaces where people were practicing low stakes ways of negotiation. And that's really important because when the stakes get high, we need to have practiced. And so one of the things that I want to be able to show you is just to bring in two voices from the book. As I said, I took people to, I asked people to take me on tours of their neighborhood. So I'm going to bring you two voices from the book, both from Brooklyn. One of them is Tanya, talking about how important the diner was for her, and the other is Neville, who's there on the left, talking about an electronics store. So Tanya says, I really like this place. Besides the fact that you see different people, you just hear people talking and joshing around. It's a very mixed crowd in here, race, sex, age. You see people from all different backgrounds. You see cops come in here, you see sanitation, you see park police, plumbers, accountants, politicians, and you hear people talking trash. It's funny, Mike gives the place its life because he'll talk to anyone and he'll talk crap with anybody. Here in New York, America, you have this whole thing about being somebody and being somebody of a certain level, the doctor, the lawyer, the Wall Street, whatever. And you have people here who make a life. They run a luncheonette and they make people happy. And they know they make people happy. They like it, they come back. They don't like it, they don't come back. It appeals to me very viscerally. It makes me realize, yeah, you need some money, but you don't need to be just chasing a dollar to the exemption of everything else. And it doesn't have to be a big thing that you do. I feel that they love it, and that makes me like it also. If I'm in a bad mood and I come in here, I walk out in a better mood. It's just the place. It's comfortable, you know? And as I was walking with Neville down the street, we walked past this boarded up building storefront, and he said, oh, my friend, who was in the same electronics business as me, he died. And they closed the store with all his stuff inside. He was a cricketer in the West Indies, and his friends, who were his old cricketers, we always used to meet every Thursday around that table, have our drink. 2 years ago, he passed away. We still meet every Thursday afternoon, still the same way. He went to the hospital for a checkup, and they found something, and they operated. And when they operated, he died. And then he said, you know, it's Thursday afternoon. We can go in. And so we walked in, and he said, see, everything's still here. The store hasn't been touched. If I need anything, I'm short of anything, instead of buying it, I get it from him. So I've never been bored by anyone's answer to the question of where would you take me on a guided tour. I never know what will come out of people's mouths, nor what surprising connections between people will emerge. And each tour makes clear the complex and really contradictory people that we all are. And so just this piece, and one of the things that I wanted to do with this work, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, was to make a public version to really think about how do we share that? How do we make space to talk about that kind of experience? And so these are some of the guides to Prospect Heights from these guided tours. So these projects are really also to show that the goal of a city is its inhabitants' well-being. The goal should be not as the city as an investment vehicle, not as a place for towers inhabited by global capital, but the city as doing necessary work for people to become themselves, to become community, and for a city to not work its people, but to work for them, for people to have a right to the city and a right to a city that does place work. So political crises, and again, we were writing this a while ago, so still very relevant, are ongoing and increasing. But a huge concern of mine was and remains the crisis of place and dialogue. So in this real post-fact time, wherein stating facts seems to have very, very little bearing on many people's opinions, I think this is where we can learn from my tour guides and the places in which they were able to build themselves and then share themselves with people they didn't know and might not have agreed with. The job of place work seems more crucial and more threatened than ever. And we're also in a moment when, still, again, we're still in that moment, when polarization simplifies and dulls identity and individual stories. When so much of our time is spent on protecting our most basic human needs to stay alive, we lose the ability to share and protect the parts of us that are the most human. We're losing the places that facilitate our sharing of the weird, specific, funny, surprising parts of ourselves, the sharing that helps us genuinely connect, and the things about people that have kept me interested in asking for guided tours for over 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thank you.
I wanted to start the conversation by thinking about beginnings or origins. So where did, you mentioned it slightly, but where did your project start?
So it started in Brooklyn, and it started because it was the neighborhood that I was living in, and I thought, it was actually started, backing up, started right after September 11th, so 2001. And I'm from here, I'm from New York, and I really felt a great need to do work that was about my city and about caring for it. And I thought one of the ways to do that was by paying attention to and understanding my neighbors. And so I started asking my neighbors, and Neville was actually the first tour, to give me a tour of our neighborhood, to talk about the places that were important to them. And I didn't know what it would turn into or what I would learn, but the idea was really to be embodied and understanding the experience of everyday place. How did your project start?
Mine couldn't have been more different. My project started, like so many, sort of in the formal public humanities. I responded to a job ad. It was the Brooklyn Historical Society, which Andrew mentioned no longer exists, right? Center for Brooklyn History, Weeksville Heritage Center, which still very much exists and is thriving, and a theater company called Irondale Ensemble Project. And just to sort of honor folks, which I'm sort of dedicated to doing, and how I got here and why I'm doing this work. There had been, during the Bloomberg administration, just to give you an idea of how slow funded public humanities works and goes, during the Bloomberg administration, they had wanted to build a new park, a hotel, an underground car park, you know how it goes, the dog park, on what was then called Duffield Street, is now called Abolitionist Place. And like so many ordinary New Yorkers and Brooklynites, it was a phenomenal woman, now the late Mama Joy Chattel, who turned around and said, my house means something, right? Talking about places that matter. And she said that her house was on the Underground Railroad, and that some more research needed to be done. You know, the erasure of that should not be taken for granted. So one thing the city does do well, because of community organizers and activists, is post-1991, right, post-African burial ground, when somebody claims historic significance, or not just claims, like can actually show you the historic significance, the city does slow down, and will put together a panel of folks to investigate. So they did. They brought in historians, archaeologists, folklorists, am I forgetting people? A whole load of experts to look at these houses. And sure enough, the conclusion was that Joy Chattel's home was more than likely, if not bang on, part of the Underground Railroad, right? People from the South seeking a better life during a time when slavery was still legal in the United States and looking to start anew here in Brooklyn or here in New York City. And like everything in New York City, they still tore down those houses, apart from Joy Chattel's. But the consequence of that was an RFP went out. Those three cultural organizations bid for it. They created a job, which was myself, a project historian who could work on this. And so what you saw there was the first iteration of that, right? It was a traditional public history project. There were exhibits, there are still walking tours that you can download. There was a K-12 curricula, a website, an original theater production. And one thing that just never happened was, because I am one person, was this book. So this book has been a long time, maybe not as long as your work is rooted, but I first stepped into an archive in April 2010. And then this book came out in September of last year. So slow moving.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing about both of these projects. And in terms of when Prithi and I have talked about them together, was thinking about the role of these projects where public aspects of them kind of have multiple kinds of audiences over time, and also iterative projects. So thinking about, well, what is this role of like public humanities, public history, art projects, public art, all of that, and then also kind of how to grapple with how does that come and turn into a book, right? I think all of those pieces are a big part of both of these projects. And so I think one of the things that also I think is important is that I know for me was, and I think for both of us, was watching the kind of public iterations of this work and understanding how people were absorbing those public projects and thinking about how that would then shape the books that they would become. So for me, I would say also the project had multiple starts. I should say also that September 11th was my first day at grad school, which is a non-auspicious day at the CUNY Grad Center. And one of the things that really, so this became my dissertation, and I worked on it for a really long time and thought about, well, what does it look like to have comparative work? Why look at Brooklyn and another city? I think it's interesting to have that comparative because New York can feel so separate and different. But I think the other piece of it then is to be living in and existing in these places over the long time since you've started the project. So, we're kind of living in real time, watching these places change and thinking about how the multiple iterations of the public work here then can be how can the research that we do either with people or in archives help be part of the conversation in the present day. And so I think when I came back to Brooklyn and was thinking about, well, I have this rather strange but actually kind of unique archive of Prospect Heights and these very everyday places before Atlantic Yards, before the Barclays Center was built, before a giant development really changed that whole part of Brooklyn, which, spoiler alert, half that housing's not built, but anyway, that's another story. How could I use this archive to help people in that moment still think about what was so important? So that was kind of where the making those tours be public came from. And I think that's sort of thinking about the exhibition too. It's like, well, it has both the exhibition and then all the ways it has lived on, and then now in the book, it plays a part now. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that piece?
Sure. So obviously an exhibit is only up for a finite amount of time, and it was up for a good chunk. It was up for 5 years, which is considered semi-permanent in exhibit land. And one thing that would always happen is, I am a public historian through and through. I did not write my first book, even though I am in another life a CUNY professor, until I was almost a decade into the tenure track, right? I believe really strongly when you want to commit to public history, there are other ways of knowledge production and dissemination. So whether that is leading a walking tour or leading a curatorial tour or working with phenomenal curriculum writers in this city who can do K through 12 curricula and send it back into the schools. But one thing I'd always get asked at the end of public programs is, where do I buy the book? And I was like, oh no, I haven't written a book, right? I am teaching a really heavy course load. I teach up at Bronx Community College, a very proud CUNY professor. And it used to be back in the day a 5-4 teaching load. So I taught 5 classes in the fall, 4 in the spring, and now it's 4-4. And there is no time at that point. Just to give it some context, if you're not part of, college life, most professors teach at most a 2-2. They'll teach 2 courses in the fall and 2 in the spring. So I was doing double the amount, still doing talks wherever I could. And so this book felt like, again, in terms of honoring folks who had come to those talks and said, where do I buy this? Or where can I find more information? I was like, that is where my labor needs to go. This needs to be written down so that it forms part of a jigsaw puzzle in which somebody takes that book, and then tomorrow, hopefully somebody else will take it and say, I found more information, or this is how the story continues, right? So I wanted that to be in dialogue and community.
And do you want to talk a little bit about the writing process?
Sure.
And kind of what brought us together? I mean, we were friends before and united by lots of things, but you had the brilliant idea that we should write together.
Thank you,
It was
Gabrielle.
your
I
idea.
appreciate you. So again, I think Gabrielle's the same, right? We enjoy hanging out with people. That is how our work primarily happens, whether for me it is traditionally inside of a classroom or whether it is with the publics, whatever that means. And so I could not think of anything more depressing than writing a book about community building, right? And community, but I'm stuck in my apartment in New York City by myself writing. So I think that was a huge thing. And then Gabrielle was also, it was just Kismet. You were also working on your book. And I said, wouldn't it be nice if we created community together? And if you, like me, are, there's a lot of demands on our time in terms of living in the city. And so I couldn't figure out how to join a traditional writing group, which is often what writers will talk about, right? They join the writing group, and I'm like, yeah, but how do you find that group? Like, I don't understand how it happens. And so to me, it felt much more organic to be with somebody who I admired and trusted in terms of the work. And to also have a writing partner, not just in terms of the practical stuff, which is important, like accountability, but also to have somebody be like, somebody's doing a renovation downstairs and all I hear is construction noise. Can I just check in with you and talk about what it is I wanted to write about today? What this land meant, what this community meant, and what community building looked like. And I feel as though, even though we were writing about completely different time periods, some of the themes just started to gel together. What we were really writing about was how ordinary people make home, and what are those spaces that exist in a city like New York that allows us to call this home.
Absolutely, and I think that piece, that wasn't actually what brought us together. To we were just sort of like, well, both of us are at this point where it sort of needs to move forward and things need to get finished, and to think about also that writing and making is labor and it takes a lot of time and it's very self-driven, and what does it take to do that work, and how can you kind of do that in community, but also it's still very individual, right? It's still very self-driven. And one of the things that I think is important is sometimes when people talk, I mentioned that, Prithi and I would sit on Zoom together, and we'd be like, okay, let's check in, and then we turn off the camera, and then, I'll see you in 45 minutes, get some stuff done, right? And people would say, oh, it's an accountability partner. And I sort of feel like that's quite punitive in a way. Like she was going to be like, yeah, well, you didn't do anything in that 45 minutes, come on, right? And I think it's that when you're driven to do this work, that life is complicated, and it's helpful to almost feel like you have a responsibility to another person and their work to turn up for them, and kind of have that sort of, it's almost a kind of mutual support rather than accountability. I really like to think about it that way, and I would, that certainly happened with me. I know I would be like, oh, something's going on with the work or family or whatever, and things seem crazy. And then I would, oh, maybe it was just not right today. But then I'd think, oh, well, Prithi's like then kind of going to be like, well, maybe I won't either. Well, okay. But it's my responsibility to show up for her, because if I don't, then I'm taking something away from her. And I think that piece of it is something that's quite important to think about, like that idea. I mean, I will say, you said, do you want to join a writing group? And I was like, no. She was like, no, just with me. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe then, yes. So just to think about that idea of what is it, and how much that kind of creation, really creative creation of space, is a big part of it. And I think one of the things that was exciting to both of us was, as we were working, how much then the themes of the work, as we're discovering kind of what the themes were as you're writing, that those things started to gel so much, and we started to feel how much of connection there was across these two books, and to be able to make those connections and see where that meaning lay, that it became even more so about kind of the deeper unpacking of the sense of, well, what is it about these spaces that people make that are about building a sense of belonging? What are these spaces that are really quite, both valuable and something that needs to be protected? How do we talk about those spaces, and how do we see that kind of across an arc of time? And I think that got to be a very exciting part of the process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, Gabrielle had written down what we should be doing next, but I'm also wondering if we should just open it up and then to
I have no idea
questions.
what time it is, so yeah.
You have no idea what time it is, Gabrielle. It's time.
Okay, good.
It's time for questions. So I think we should do that and then fit in
Sounds
what's
good.
important now.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions?
Hello. We do have mics just so that we can hear your questions, so everybody can hear you.
Hey, how you guys doing?
Good, thanks.
All right, I got a question. I'm from the Caribbean, right? And I'm living in Brooklyn for like years now. And do you think it's fair that the black-owned communities, right, that the Jews is taking over, the Jews and the Muslim, they're just taking over our black communities, especially our Redstones? Why? Is it fair?
One of the things that I think a lot about in terms of thinking about what does it mean to think about Black-owned businesses and how important they are. A lot of the people that I interviewed really talked about how they saw the role, especially in Prospect Heights, where you can really see that shift and that change. That people talked about how not only was it about thinking about the businesses that they went to or frequented or what those businesses sold, but also about the fact that people talked about what they meant to their kids. So a bunch of people in Prospect Heights, especially when I went back in 2016 and then again in 2018 with the tour, like kind of guided tour books, which most of the places that people had originally taken me to were no longer there. People talked about the idea that they had talked about children growing up in Prospect Heights and had said, my kid grew up and saw lots of Black-owned businesses, right? Saw lots of people around and saw those people as role models and knew that that was something that they could be too. And that one of the things that they talked about as being painful was in gentrification, was in feeling like, well, if they knew that their kid was growing up now, that they wouldn't have that role model. And I think that's something that is like a piece to tease out around what that role is. And I would say that's something from the research and from all this kind of embeddedness in the place that came up over and over again, and how kind of painful that was for people's sense of thinking about the role of what those businesses meant to their kids and the possibilities kind of going forward. So I think that's what I would say about that. Is there another question?
Well, thank you both so much. I'm just curious because I know you started your project like back in 2001, and there's been a lot of research and I guess commentary on like kind of the decline of third places and obviously like disconnection. But I'm wondering if like did you see a shift, like because I mean researchers have said that that's happened in the past like couple decades. So I'm just wondering if you like saw that happening while you were interviewing, or if you feel like at a more like neighborhood level, those places were really remaining strong.
Well, one of the things I would say, so we were talking about beginnings of these projects. For me, like this project had maybe 5 beginnings, and the most recent beginning was during COVID. And so I think like in terms of Prithi thinking about like people asking her, where's the book? No one was asking me where the book was, but it was during COVID when in lockdown, and I thought, these people stories live in my head because I've listened to them so often, and I love them and I respect them. And I think actually one of the things that I think actually also unites both of these books is kind of like thinking about the book as a repository and a way to care for stories and really respect them. So I kind of always have wanted to make something beautiful for those stories. But the other thing I realized is that how terrible it felt to be away from strangers, right? Like that maybe you were with your family, but you couldn't see the people that you just bump into on the street, and how bad that felt. And I started to think about the fact that, like, well, these things that people have been telling me for years were a great explanation of why that mattered so much. And I think that piece of it was the part that helped me understand, like, well, why should this be a book now? Why does it matter now? What's at stake, right? What are the kind of the push of that? And so I think there's been that sort of separation that certainly has been, I mean, you can point to a lot of things, right? You can look at, I mean, you could even look at TV as a thing that takes us out of the public realm, right? That's kind of a long time ago. But to think about all these things that and then we have this thing in our hands that takes us completely out of where we are, right? So all of that process of separation from each other has been going on for a long time. But I think COVID also was the most extreme version of that, right? And I think that piece of it, and also how much that did in terms of how many places closed that either had been closing or had closed during COVID, that people really lost places for gathering. And I think that piece kind of pushes us over the edge, and genuinely to, as we were saying, you know, we were writing these, you know, 2 and 3 years ago, kind of thinking about the politics of then, which the politics of then is just more so now, right? And so one of the reasons that it seems like it really matters is that we seem to be very incapable of talking with each other, right? So it's not just that it's like these spaces matter because it's nice to have, but that we need the capacity to practice actually negotiation. And I think that piece of it is something that's really been playing on my mind. That was a long-winded answer to your question. Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of how that relates to like thinking about it archivally and historically?
So everything I write about in terms of Brooklyn is gone, right? There is nothing there. If you go there today, it is condos. It is the Brooklyn Bridge. All of those places are not just gone, but in the way that we commemorate landscapes, there are no historic markers for any of those places. And so I think, like Gabrielle, a lot of the work is about stuff that has been forgotten, and also remembering. But also, I think one of the things that I sort of frame this as is these stories were never really lost. I never use that framing for my work. They're not waiting to be discovered. It's just that we're not telling the stories loud enough about our histories. And so that is where I think thinking about things that were gone, right? If we keep telling the stories, because the stuff is physically gone. If you go there today, you know, you're looking at Dumbo and you're looking at a ton of tourists in the middle of summer. But it's important to keep telling these stories. And so I think that's why I always think this book is part of a jigsaw puzzle. Somebody will come tomorrow and come up with a different project, whether it's a new walking tour around that area, or maybe, and there are brilliant people who do this, and thinking of our mutual friend Eric Washington, a force who will go through all the bureaucratic tape in this city to try and landmark things, or get that really traditional historic marker, or rename streets, which is a whole skill set in itself. So yeah, all of my work essentially is talking about things that have been forgotten and gone, but how we remember them is as equally important.
One more question, maybe for somebody else? Yeah.
I have a
question for you. I do know. Is this loud enough, or is it any? Okay. I know a little bit about Gabrielle and where she comes from and all this. And so I know kind of how she came to an interest in these stories and why there was something in her past that made her want to do this. And my curiosity is, what was it that brought you to want to know about this kind of a history?
Gabrielle, do you want to reveal who the question
The mystery speaker is my mother, so she knows just a little bit more than she's letting on.
But I didn't want to do that. Yeah. But so I'm wondering, what was it that the seed of this that brought you to that kind of interest in history and how it marks people or how it helps them become who they are?
Thank you for the question. So the question is, Gabrielle's mum has clearly identified I'm not from around here, right? I don't sound like I'm from around here. I'm from Liverpool, very proud Scouser. But how I came to this, so how I came to these ideas is I've always believed in shared histories. You know, people will say, well, how did you get interested in New York City history? And I'm like, I know New Yorkers believe this about their city, and they should. I've lived here 20 plus years. I believe it myself. But New York is similar to other cities, believe it or not, and one of those cities is Liverpool. 19th century port cities made their money in exactly the same way on the Atlantic slave trade and on the oppression and traumatic labor of people of African descent. And as a result of that, they made a lot of money that made these cities look gorgeous, right? We have very similar architecture. So as a young person growing up in Liverpool, certainly not somebody of African descent, right? I am Desi. My parents moved from India to Liverpool. But I am obsessed with shared histories. What are the commonalities? What are the shared struggles? Who are the folks in our historical narratives that have found moments of solidarity and organized together? And that has always been my interest. And so in terms of the professional stuff, when I got to graduate school, I did a master's degree, and it doesn't exist anymore, like so much of the good stuff that used to happen in universities. It was called Colonial, Post-Colonial Cultures, and it was exactly that ethos, right? That across the globe, we have shared struggles, shared histories, and that we should be able to learn from each other. So going into my PhD program, I was looking at performance culture across the Atlantic, which was my introduction to this wonderful city of New York, and thinking about 19th century performance culture and race and ways in which the slave trade and slavery was being interpreted by creative folks back in the day. And then this particular part, because I do get asked by proud Brooklynites, why Brooklyn? That was a job, truly. That was post-PhD, cultural organizations, advertising, me coming along and saying, yes, I can do this. Like, I can work with a theater company. I know how to work with 19th century archives. But 15 plus years later, I think the work has become so much deeper. I think it speaks to a vision that I would like to see for this city. And I think what Gabrielle was saying about having really difficult conversations about the city in order to get to a better place tomorrow, right? If we're not having those conversations, I will often have students in my classroom say, why wasn't I taught this when we do public programs? Why don't we talk about this more? And I'm like, yes, why don't we? You know, as somebody who grew up reading that classic 19th century Victorian novel and Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice and all those gorgeous houses, and you never know where Darcy's made his money, but if you know your history, you're like, Mr. Darcy had some investments in the British Empire somewhere, like something was happening. And so I really am committed to, in this life, trying to unpack the beauty, right? Pride and Prejudice, beautiful novel. But unpacking our histories and how we all got here so that we're having really honest conversations about how we build a more just world tomorrow.
Hello, how are you? I'm happy I'm here today to hear this. There are two things I'm sort of dwelling on. Okay, one, we know in reference to the background. We know that this is happening throughout the whole city, I'm not only I'm talking not really only for Brooklyn, but um, I believe Miss what's her name? Prithi?
Yeah,
Prithi?
Prithi. Yeah,
Okay. You spoke about even the Afro burial ground, and I remember that happening and the struggle in order to keep it, and even to bring it up and really do the research on that. Because I worked downtown at that point in time. In addition to, you said you went, Miss Gabriella spoke about, being going to grad school 9/11. So I'm assuming that you were down here within the time, similar situation. So how do we get from things are moving on, but how do we get to sort of wind back and probably find a way to take a note. I believe that's what you're doing in your books, which is very good. But how do we get the recognition? The correct recognition, I should say. How do we? Are there any ideas of how you get the recognition to be corrected? And what could we do about it? That's some of the things I want to say. All these acts.
I think as a historian, we record these stories, and I don't just mean in the written word, right? Oral histories, public programs like this, that you're talking about a book essentially, but actually what it is an invitation for all of us to talk about what have we lost. And I don't know, even as a historian, if I want to go back necessarily, but what have we lost, and therefore what do we need to rebuild? You have me on board. So definitely telling stories, walking tours. Marion Carver does an amazing walking tour called Slavery and Freedom, in which she's talking about the 17th and 18th centuries, and she's taking you through downtown Manhattan. She's a well-known organizer and abolitionist here in the city. But the story she's telling could be about stories from yesterday, right? She's connecting past to present. So I really do believe in gatherings like these, in which we're sharing each other's stories, and commemorating and honoring them is just one thing that we can do. And for somebody like myself, go teach those stories and histories in a classroom. Go work with K through 12 educators so they can do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the pieces, Prithi, just as you were saying, like that thing of how do we rebuild? So I often tell this story that kind of early on in this project, somebody had said to me, well, like, that's really nice that you're doing this stuff with people about their everyday places, but like, why? Like, why does that matter? On one hand, it made me very angry. But on the other hand, it made me think, well, like, okay, well, what is, because the question was really like, what's the purpose? And I started to think about it. And at the time, Hurricane Katrina had just happened. And I thought, one of the things to think about is like, well, what happens when people rebuild? So you physically may have the documentation of the buildings that were there, right? Or who owned the land. But how do you actually rebuild what happened in those places, right? Certainly you could listen to people, right? You could interview them. You could find out about the kind of their memories of the place and what the meaning was. But I thought, well, what would happen if you kind of had done this work? You've been paying attention all this time to really, I think what the work is around community preservation. So if you'd been saying, okay, we recognize that something important happens in this community, let's understand where and how, and maybe let's try and preserve it. But, we don't have to have a national disaster happen, right? That kind of a man-made national disaster, right? Like, we don't have to have that to actually think about what does it look like to preserve community. And so I've thought about that a lot, and I will say one of the things that, kind of I kept thinking about that kind of Katrina question. And then when I had gone away from Prospect Heights and come back, maybe 10 years, and I was like astonished by the change in the neighborhood. And I thought, oh, wait, it wasn't like a hurricane, it was rampant development, right? And what happens to neighborhoods when large-scale development happens on their edge and we don't protect small businesses? We know that we don't protect affordable housing, right? That what happens to those places in which people are able to kind of build themselves and do this work of building belonging and building place, right? So that was part of what prompted me, and kind of to this point that Prithi is making, is like, if we look at even what I had were archives of 10 years previous, but somehow all of a sudden they seemed historical, to talk about those stories and to say, like, let's walk around and read these stories back in the place, right? It doesn't make what happened go away, but it does help kind of make that space to talk about it, and to think like, okay, how could you do things differently going forward? Which, on one hand, I wish there was a better solution, and I think there are real solutions in terms of policy and protection and what does it take to keep people in their homes, keep businesses where they like those kinds of things. But I think this capacity for building work that makes these spaces for conversation is a big part of it as well. And so I think that's part of where these two books, these two projects really kind of come in to try and say, okay, well, what does it look like to make those spaces possible, and to try and look at these people's histories as the potential for building something new and better, right? I think that's some of the tension for me. Yeah.
That's actually all the time we have. So I just want to ask if you have any final thoughts, and then our authors are going to join us. They're going to join us outside. So if you have any more questions, any final thoughts?
I have none. I'm so sorry for the anticlimax.
They're all in that book. I think we just really want to thank you all for being here. Truly, it is a dream come true to be able to have this conversation and for Prithi and I to talk together about these two books, because in some ways, we come from different disciplines. A lot of the time, certainly it's different historical periods that we're talking about. And I think a lot of the time we don't get to talk across those things, to talk about kind of these core ideas. And so being able to do that and talk about these ideas from kind of to turn them around from a bunch of different angles and to be able to share them kind of from the way that we've been approaching them is really quite an honor. So thank you all for making that happen and being here with us. Thank you.